The grandfather clock in the corner of Robert's mahogany study ticks with a heavy, rhythmic finality. It is the only sound in this massive, empty house, aside from the relentless rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I am sitting in his leather armchair, the one that still faintly smells of his expensive cedarwood cologne and the black coffee he drank every single morning. I am wrapped in his old cashmere sweater, staring out at the blurred lights of the city below, realizing that for the first time in 25 years, I am completely and utterly alone. I kept quiet for a quarter of a century. For 25 long years, I allowed the world to look at me with disguised disgust. I allowed them to whisper behind my back at charity galas, at elite country club dinners, at family gatherings, and finally, 3 days ago, at his funeral. The funeral was a spectacle of fake grief and very real hostility. We stood under a canopy of black umbrellas in the freezing November rain at Oakwood Cemetery. Robert's children from his first marriage were there, of course. Richard, his eldest son, who is actually 5 years older than me, couldn't even bring himself to look me in the eye. Eleanor, his daughter, wore a veil that barely concealed the sneer on her face. I heard what she whispered to her husband as they watched me place a single white rose on Robert's casket. "She finally got what she was waiting for," Eleanor murmured, her voice dripping with venom. "Look at her. Not a single tear. She's probably already mentally redecorating the summer house. It makes me sick. He was 58 when she dug her claws into him, and she was barely 23. She stole his golden years just to secure the estate." I didn't turn around. I didn't defend myself. I didn't scream at her that she had no idea who her father truly was, or that she hadn't bothered to visit him for the last 3 years while his health was declining. I simply stood there, dressed in black, holding my umbrella, and let them believe whatever ugly, comforting lies they needed to tell themselves. I let them believe I was the classic, high-priced parasite, a young trophy wife who traded her youth for a billionaire's bank account. Because the truth is something so profound, so complex, and so terrifying that their narrow, privileged minds wouldn't have been able to comprehend it, even if I spelled it out for them. My name is Elena. I am 48 years old now, and last week, I lost the only man who ever truly loved me. Robert was a formidable man, a retired industrial magnate who built a steel empire from absolutely nothing. He had hands like sandpaper, a voice that commanded immediate respect, and a piercing gaze that could make a seasoned corporate lawyer stammer in fear. To the outside world, he was a ruthless businessman who succumbed to a midlife crisis and bought himself a pretty young girl. But as I sit here in the dark, pouring myself a small glass of his favorite scotch, I know that my silence no longer serves a purpose. My silence was meant to protect him, to protect his legacy, and to keep the demons of my past buried where they belonged. But the will has been read now. The vultures are circling the inheritance, preparing their legal teams to contest my position. They think I am weak without him. They think I am just a naive widow who struck gold. It is finally time to wipe those smug, arrogant smiles off their faces. It is time to tell the story of the man they didn't know. People think I stole Robert's fortune. They think I saw a wealthy older man and saw an opportunity. They don't know that 25 years ago, Robert didn't buy my youth. He didn't seduce me with sports cars, diamond necklaces, or promises of a luxurious life. 25 years ago, Robert saved my life. To understand why a 23-year-old girl willingly walked down the aisle with a man 35 years her senior, and why she loved him with a fierce, unwavering loyalty until his very last breath, you have to understand the absolute hell I was running from. You have to strip away the mansions, the wealth, and the society gossip. You have to go back to a dingy, neon-lit diner in the bad part of the city. And most importantly, you have to understand the monster who was hunting me, and the impossible choice Robert made the night he decided to step between me and certain death. 25 years ago, my reality was entirely different from the quiet luxury of this mahogany-paneled study. I wasn't draped in cashmere, and I certainly wasn't sipping aged scotch. I was 23 years old, severely underweight, constantly exhausted, and living in a perpetual state of suffocating terror. I worked as a waitress at a 24-hour diner located on the gritty edge of the city's financial district. It was the kind of place that smelled permanently of stale frying oil, cheap bleach, and burnt filter coffee. I worked the graveyard shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., pouring bottomless cups of coffee for exhausted stockbrokers, insomniac truck drivers, and the occasional night shift beat cop. I lived in a tiny, damp basement apartment that I could barely afford, existing on a diet of instant noodles and whatever leftover toast they let me take home from the diner kitchen. But poverty wasn't the reason I couldn't sleep at night. Poverty was manageable. The real reason I jammed a heavy wooden chair under my apartment door handle every single night, the reason I jumped at the sound of every passing siren and constantly looked over my shoulder, was a man named Marcus. Marcus was my ex-boyfriend. To the rest of the world, he was Detective Marcus Thorne, a highly decorated, charismatic, and deeply respected officer in the city's Violent Crimes Division. He was the guy who bought drinks for everyone at the local bar, the guy the mayor shook hands with on television. But behind closed doors, when the charming smile dropped, he was a calculated, sadistic psychopath who viewed me not as a human being, but as his exclusive personal property. When I finally gathered the courage to pack a single duffel bag and run into the night, I didn't just break up with him, I escaped. But running from a decorated detective in a city where he knows every patrol officer is like trying to hide from the sky. Before I left, he had cornered me in the kitchen, his fingers wrapping around my throat just tight enough to let me know he could snap it if he wanted to. He leaned in, smelling of peppermint and stale whiskey, and whispered a promise I will never forget. If I can't have you, Elena, absolutely nobody will. And if you even think about going to my colleagues for help, remember who they are going to believe. The hysterical, broke waitress or the hero cop. They will bring you right back to me, and the next time you try to leave, you'll be leaving in a bag. He wasn't lying. I was trapped in an invisible cage, waiting for the inevitable day he would track me down. The dark, hand-shaped bruises on my arms and ribs were slowly fading into a sickly yellow, but the psychological terror was eating me alive from the inside out. That was the week I first noticed Robert. Robert was 58, a titan of industry whose steel manufacturing firm was headquartered just 3 blocks away in a towering glass skyscraper. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, precisely at 11:15 p.m., he would walk into our dingy diner. He looked entirely out of place, a mountain of a man with thick silver hair, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal overcoat and a gold watch that probably cost more than my entire life's earnings. He always sat in the exact same corner booth, ordered a single cup of black coffee, and spent the next hour meticulously reading through thick stacks of legal documents and financial reports. He was incredibly intimidating. The other waitresses, usually eager to flirt with wealthy men from the district, practically drew straws to see who had to serve him. He rarely smiled, and he didn't engage in small talk, but to me, there was something deeply grounding about his presence. Unlike the younger, sleazier men who came in after a night of drinking and made cheap, suggestive comments about my uniform, Robert never looked at me with that predatory hunger. He just observed. He had these sharp, piercing, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through the cheap polyester of my uniform and straight into my exhausted soul. The turning point happened on a miserable, rainy Tuesday. Much like tonight, the diner was almost entirely empty. I was carrying a tray of thick ceramic coffee mugs back to the kitchen when my foot caught on a torn piece of linoleum. I stumbled, and the tray crashed to the floor, shattering 3 mugs. As I immediately dropped to my knees, frantically sweeping the jagged ceramic shards into my bare hands, the sleeve of my uniform slipped up past my elbow. There, exposed under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights, was a massive, horrific bruise in the distinct shape of a man's gripping hand. Marcus's parting gift. I gasped, instantly pulling the sleeve down, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I looked up, terrified that someone had seen. Robert was sitting in his corner booth, his pen frozen over his documents. He was staring directly at my arm. I expected pity. I expected him to look away in awkward discomfort, like most people do when confronted with the ugly reality of domestic abuse. But Robert didn't look pitying. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered in his cheek. His eyes were completely dark, practically vibrating with a cold, terrifying, and tightly controlled rage. He didn't say a single word to me that night. He simply stood up, left a crisp $100 bill under his coffee saucer, and walked out into the rain. I thought that was the end of it. But I didn't know that the universe was already setting a collision course. Because exactly 3 days later, my worst nightmare finally found me. It was 2 a.m. on a Friday. The bell above the diner door jingled, and the air in my lungs instantly turned to ice. Marcus walked in. He was off duty, wearing a leather jacket, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild. He spotted me immediately behind the counter. The diner was dead quiet, save for one trucker asleep in a booth and Robert, reading in his usual corner. Marcus didn't care who was watching. He stormed behind the counter, grabbed my arm with brutal force, his fingers digging directly into the fading bruise he had left weeks prior, and began dragging me toward the back alley exit. "Thought you could hide from me, you stupid bitch," he hissed, his grip tight enough to snap my bone. "We're going home. Now." I tried to scream, but my throat was paralyzed with absolute terror. I was thrashing, my cheap sneakers slipping on the greasy floor, knowing with horrifying certainty that if he got me out that back door, I was a dead woman. And then, a voice echoed through the diner. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a plea. It was a deep, gravelly, earth-shattering command that carried the full weight of a man who was used to destroying empires before breakfast. "Take your hand off my fiancé!" The air in the diner felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. Marcus froze. His hand was still clamped around my bicep like a vice, but for the first time since I had known him, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He slowly turned his head toward the corner booth, expecting to see some meddling Good Samaritan he could easily intimidate with his badge. Instead, he found himself staring into the cold, unwavering eyes of Robert Miller. Robert hadn't stood up yet. He was still sitting, his large hands resting flat on the table, framing his legal documents. He looked like a king who had just been interrupted by a bothersome insect. Marcus let out a sharp, jagged laugh, though it sounded forced. He didn't release me. If anything, his grip tightened, sending a fresh wave of throbbing pain through my arm. "Your fiancé?" Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with mock disbelief. "Listen, old man, you've clearly had one too many whiskeys. This is official police business. This girl is a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. Now stay in your seat and mind your own business before I charge you with obstruction." It was a classic Marcus move. Use the badge, use the authority, hide the monster behind the law. I looked at Robert, my eyes pleading, my heart sinking. I knew how this went. Most people, even wealthy ones, didn't want trouble with the police. They would apologize, look away, and let the officer do his job. But Robert didn't flinch. He slowly closed his leather-bound folder, the click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the silent diner. Then he stood up. Standing at his full height, Robert was even more imposing. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that suggested he had never lost a fight in his life, not in a boardroom, and certainly not in a street brawl. He walked toward us, stopping only when he was inches from Marcus. The contrast was staggering. Marcus was lean, wiry, and vibrating with erratic, caffeinated energy. Robert was a solid wall of calm, expensive wool and ancient, unshakable authority. "Officer Thorne, I believe," Robert said. His voice was low, vibrating with a frequency that seemed to shake the very floorboards. "Badge number 4421, Violent Crimes Division, currently off duty, currently intoxicated, and currently committing an assault on a private citizen in a public establishment with at least 3 witnesses and a functioning security camera." Marcus's face turned a deep, mottled purple. "I told you to back off, old man. You don't know who you're dealing with." "On the contrary," Robert whispered, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "I know exactly who you are. I know about your exemplary record that conveniently hides 3 internal affairs complaints that were lost by your captain. I know about the apartment in Queens you pay for in cash. And I know that in approximately 10 seconds, if you don't release that young woman, I am going to call the police commissioner, who happens to be a very close personal friend of mine, and explain to him why one of his detectives is ending his career tonight over a waitress." Robert reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek, gold-plated cell phone. He didn't dial. He just held it, his thumb hovering over the screen. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity. I could feel Marcus's pulse racing through his hand on my arm. He was calculating. He was a predator, and he had just realized he wasn't the biggest shark in the ocean. For Marcus, the badge was everything. Without it, he was just a small man with a big temper. With a final, violent shove that sent me stumbling against the counter, Marcus let go. He stepped back, his eyes darting between Robert and the camera in the corner. He tried to reclaim some shred of his pride. "You're making a mistake, old man," Marcus hissed, pointing a trembling finger at Robert. "You can't protect her forever. She's a broken toy. You'll get bored of her, and when you do, I'll be there." Robert didn't blink. He didn't even acknowledge the threat. He simply stepped in front of me, shielding my body with his own, creating a barrier of warmth and safety I hadn't felt in years. "Leave," Robert said. One word, an ultimatum. Marcus spat on the floor, threw a final murderous look in my direction, and stormed out of the diner. The bell jingled aggressively, then faded into silence. I collapsed. My legs simply gave out, and I would have hit the floor if Robert hadn't caught me. His hands were huge, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He guided me to the nearest booth, ignoring the shocked stares of the other waitress and the trucker who had finally woken up. "Breath, Elena," he said. It was the first time he had ever used my name. "He's gone. He won't be coming back tonight." I was shaking so hard I couldn't speak. My teeth were chattering, and I couldn't stop looking at the door, expecting Marcus to burst back in with a gun. I looked up at this stranger, this wealthy, powerful man who had just risked his reputation for a girl who served him coffee. "Why?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "You don't even know me." "Why did you say I was your fiancé? Why would you help me?" Robert looked at me, and for the first time, the cold rage in his eyes softened into something I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pity. It was a deep, ancient recognition. "Because, Elena," he said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat, "I spent 40 years building a world where men like that think they can do whatever they want. And tonight, I decided I was finished allowing it. But he was right about one thing. I can't protect you forever as a stranger, but I can protect you as my wife." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "Your wife? You're serious?" "I am a businessman, Elena. I don't make offers I'm not prepared to settle," he said, sliding a clean napkin across the table toward me. "You have 2 choices. You can stay here, and eventually he will find a way around me. Or you can come with me. I will give you my name, my protection, and a life where no one will ever lay a finger on you again. In exchange, you will be the mistress of my home. You will give me the one thing my money can't buy, a reason to come home to a house that isn't empty. He wasn't asking for love. He wasn't asking for my soul. He was offering a contract of survival. And as I looked at the bruise on my arm, and then at the silver-haired titan sitting across from me, I realized that for the first time in my life, the trap I was walking into had a golden key. I moved into Robert's estate 3 days after that night at the diner. The house was a fortress of glass, stone, and silence, perched high above the city like an eagle's nest. My bedroom was larger than the entire apartment I had fled, filled with silk sheets and the scent of fresh lilies. But for the first few weeks, I couldn't stop jumping at every shadow. I would wake up at 3 a.m., drenched in cold sweat, convinced that Marcus had bypassed the high-tech security gates and the silent guards Robert employed. Robert didn't push me, he didn't demand intimacy, or even my constant presence. He was a man of routines, a clockwork titan. He would leave for the office at 7 a.m. and return at 6 p.m. Every evening we would have dinner in the grand dining room, sitting at opposite ends of a long mahogany table. "Did you eat today, Elena?" he would ask, his voice low and steady. It was a simple question, but coming from him, it felt like a lifeline. He wasn't asking out of polite obligation. He was monitoring my recovery like a master builder checking the foundation of a damaged structure. The gossip began almost immediately. The tabloids called it a midlife madness, and Robert's business associates looked at me with thin, patronizing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. But the loudest noise came from Robert's children. They arrived 2 weeks after our quiet courthouse wedding, a legal formality that Robert insisted on for my absolute protection. Richard and Eleanor didn't come to welcome me. They came to inspect the investment their father had made. "You realize, Dad, that this is going to be a PR nightmare for the firm," Richard had said, loud enough for me to hear from the hallway. "She's a waitress. She's 23. Everyone thinks you've lost your mind. If you wanted a companion, you could have hired a dozen professionals for half the price of a marriage license." I waited for Robert to apologize for me or to explain my situation, but Robert didn't explain. He never explained himself to anyone. "Richard," Robert's voice drifted through the door, cold and sharp. "I didn't ask for your opinion on my private affairs. Elena is my wife. She is the mistress of this house. If you cannot treat her with the respect that title demands, you are more than welcome to never step foot in this house again. And keep in mind, your inheritance is a privilege, not a right." That was the first time I realized that Robert wasn't just shielding me from Marcus. He was shielding me from the world. He was a wall of iron between me and everyone who wanted to hurt me. The shift in our relationship happened slowly, during the quiet hours after dinner. We began to spend time in his study. He would read his reports, and I would sit in the armchair across from him, reading the books I never had time to finish while working double shifts. Sometimes we wouldn't speak for hours, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. One night, a massive thunderstorm rolled over the city. A lightning strike nearby caused the power to flicker and die. In the sudden, oppressive darkness, my trauma surged back. I was 23 again, trapped in the kitchen with Marcus's hands around my throat. I couldn't breathe. I began to gasp, a low, panicked sound tearing from my chest. Suddenly, I felt a large, warm hand on my shoulder. Robert didn't pull me into a forced embrace. He just sat on the edge of the ottoman next to me, his presence a solid, unshakable weight in the dark. "Focus on my voice, Elena," he whispered. "You are in my house. You are behind 6 inches of reinforced glass. I am right here. Nothing gets to you unless it goes through me first. And nothing is strong enough to go through me." I reached out and grabbed his hand. His skin was rough, aged, and incredibly strong. In that moment, looking at the silhouette of this man who was old enough to be my father, I didn't see a benefactor or a businessman. I saw a man who had chosen to carry my burden as his own. I didn't marry him for his money. I married him because he was the only person who ever made the world feel small enough to handle. And as the months turned into years, the contract we signed became a bond that was stronger than blood. I began to see the man behind the titan, the loneliness he hid behind his wealth, the way his children only called when they needed a wire transfer, and the quiet sadness he felt about a life spent building things instead of living. We weren't a scandal. We were two survivors who found a port in the middle of a storm. And that was the secret I guarded for 25 years, that the young trophy wife was, in fact, the only person who truly knew the heart of the man the world called ruthless. For 3 years, I lived in a state of fragile, beautiful peace. I was 26, and Robert was 61. To the outside world, we were still the billionaire and his purchased bride. But inside the stone walls of his estate, we were a team. I learned how to manage the massive household, how to host his corporate dinners with quiet grace, and how to read the subtle shifts in his mood when the stress of his empire weighed heavily on his shoulders. I thought the ghost of my past had finally stopped haunting me. I thought Marcus had realized he couldn't touch the wife of Robert Miller. I was wrong. It happened on a cold, gray afternoon in late November. I had just left a charity luncheon downtown and was walking toward our waiting town car. The street was relatively quiet. My driver, Thomas, was standing by the trunk, holding an umbrella. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my wrist. It wasn't gentle. It was a familiar, bone-crushing grip that sent an instant shockwave of pure terror straight to my core. "Did you really think I'd just let you go, Elena?" I turned, my breath catching in my throat. It was Marcus, but he didn't look like the charismatic, arrogant detective anymore. He looked unhinged. He smelled of stale alcohol and cheap cigarettes. His eyes were bloodshot, and his leather jacket was worn. He pulled me slightly closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "I've been watching you," he hissed, a sick smile twisting his lips, playing the perfect little rich wife. "But he's getting older, Elena. I see him walking with that cane now. He's an old man. He can't protect you forever. When his heart finally gives out, or when he gets bored and throws you out, you're mine again. And I'm going to make you pay for every single day you humiliated me." Before I could even scream, Thomas, my driver, stepped forward, his hand reaching inside his jacket. But Marcus just flashed his police badge with a sneer. "Back off, chauffeur." Official police business. Marcus let go of my wrist, gave me a sickening wink, and disappeared into the crowd. I was trembling so violently when I got into the car that I couldn't even buckle my seatbelt. When I arrived home, Robert was waiting in his study. He took one look at my pale face and the fresh red marks on my wrist, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I told him everything. I cried, admitting my deepest fear, that Marcus was right. That one day Robert wouldn't be there, and the monster would come back to finish what he started. Robert didn't hold me. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply walked over to his heavy mahogany desk, picked up his phone, and looked at me with eyes so dark they looked like obsidian. "Go upstairs, Elena. Take a hot bath. Lock the door if it makes you feel safe," he commanded gently. "And completely erase Marcus Thorne from your memory. Because as of this exact second, he no longer exists in our world." I didn't know what Robert meant. I thought he was going to hire more security, or maybe pay Marcus off. But I fundamentally underestimated the man I married. Robert didn't do half measures. He was an architect of empires, and when threatened, he was an architect of absolute ruin. I didn't see Robert for the rest of the evening. He stayed in his study, making phone calls that lasted long into the night. 3 days later, I was sitting in the kitchen drinking my morning tea when the breaking news flashed across the television screen. High-ranking city detective indicted in massive federal corruption sweep. There on the screen was Marcus. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands heavily cuffed in front of him, being led into a federal courthouse by 2 FBI agents. The news anchor's voice echoed through the kitchen. Marcus was being charged with racketeering, severe evidence tampering, extortion, and ties to organized crime. Robert walked into the kitchen, dressed in his perfectly tailored morning suit, holding his black coffee. He glanced at the television, then looked at me. "I didn't just warn him 3 years ago, Elena," Robert said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I hired 3 former federal investigators the day after I brought you to this house. They have spent the last 3 years quietly digging into every single arrest he ever made, every dollar he ever spent, and every criminal he ever protected. I had a 400-page dossier sitting in my safe, just waiting." He walked over to me, placing a warm, calloused hand on my cheek. I was willing to let him rot in his own misery if he stayed away, but he touched my wife again. So, last night, I personally handed that dossier to the director of the FBI over dinner. Marcus Thorne will never see the outside of a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. I stared at Robert, my heart pounding, entirely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what he had done. He hadn't just shielded me, he had systematically, legally, and permanently destroyed the monster in my closet. Marcus was right about one thing. Robert was getting older, but he was entirely wrong about his strength. Robert Miller didn't need youth to protect me. He possessed something far more dangerous. He had absolute power, and he had weaponized every single ounce of it just to make sure I could finally sleep through the night. Time is a cruel thief, even for a titan like Robert. The years that followed Marcus's imprisonment were the happiest of my life, but they were also the fastest. We traveled, we laughed, and we built a quiet, private universe within the walls of our estate. But as I hit 40 and Robert entered his late 70s, the Silver Mountain began to crumble. It started with a slight tremor in his hands, the hands that had once built empires. Then came the cane, and eventually the specialists who whispered about heart failure and fading strength. Robert hated it. He hated the weakness, the pills, and the way the world began to look at him as a relic of the past rather than a force of nature. But as his physical strength waned, his children's devotion suddenly spiked. Richard and Eleanor, who hadn't visited for years, were suddenly at our door every weekend. They didn't come with flowers or concern. They came with lawyers, with papers, and with eyes that constantly scanned the room as if they were already mentally tagging the antiques for an auction. One afternoon, while Robert was napping upstairs, I found Richard in the study, shamelessly going through the files on Robert's desk. "Can I help you find something, Richard?" I asked, my voice cold and steady. He didn't even look guilty. He just straightened his tie and sneered. "I'm just making sure my father's affairs are in order, Elena. He's clearly not in his right mind anymore. We're considering filing for power of attorney. You've had a good run, but let's be honest. You're a distraction he can no longer afford. When the time comes, don't think for a second you're keeping this house." I felt the old fear for a split second, but then I remembered who had raised me for the last 25 years. I wasn't that terrified waitress from the diner anymore. I was a woman who had been mentored by the most ruthless businessmen in the country. "Richard," I said, walking slowly toward him until I was in his personal space. "Your father is more in his right mind on his worst day than you are on your best. If you ever touch his private documents again, I won't call him. I'll call the firm's board of directors and show them the evidence of the gambling debts you've been hiding for the last 2 years. Yes, Robert knows. He always knows. He just didn't tell you because he wanted to see if you'd ever become a man on your own." Richard turned pale. He sputtered, tried to insult me, but eventually slunk out of the room like a beaten dog. That evening, I sat by Robert's bed. He looked so frail against the white pillows, but when he opened his eyes, the fire was still there. He reached out and took my hand, his grip weak but his intent clear. "They're circling, aren't they?" he whispered, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. "They are," I admitted, kissing the back of his hand. "But don't worry, I've learned from the best. They won't get a single penny they haven't earned, and they certainly won't get to you." Robert watched me for a long time. "You were the best investment I ever made, Elena. Not because of the house or the status, but because you're the only person who ever looked at the man, not the bank account. I didn't save your life 25 years ago. You gave me 25 years of actual life. Everything I have, it's all yours. Because you're the only one I trust to handle it." I realized then that our secret wasn't just about Marcus or the rescue. The real secret was that in a world of greed and fake smiles, we had found something real. He gave me safety, and in return, I gave him a reason to keep fighting long after his body wanted to quit. I wasn't his trophy, I was his partner. And as the vultures gathered in the hallway, I knew I was ready to defend him the same way he had defended me in that diner all those years ago. The rain has slowed to a rhythmic tapping against the window, and the scotch in my glass is nearly gone. The silence in the house is no longer heavy, it's triumphant. Yesterday, the will was officially executed in the presence of Robert's children and his lifelong legal team. I can still see the looks on Richard and Eleanor's faces, the way their smug confidence drained away, replaced by a pale, stuttering disbelief. They expected the estate to be carved up, with me receiving a generous parting gift before being shown the door. They were wrong. Robert didn't just leave me the house and a fund. He left me everything. The firm, the properties, the controlling interest in the empire he spent 50 years building. But there was a catch, a final, brilliant move that only a man like Robert could conceive. He left his children a video message, recorded just weeks before he passed. In it, he sat in this very chair, looking tired but sharper than ever. He told them that for 25 years, he had watched them wait for his death. He told them he knew about the secret meetings with lawyers, the debts, and the lack of respect they had shown the woman who had cared for him when they were too busy spending his money. "You thought Elena was the one who was bought," Robert said on the screen, his voice steady and cold. "But in reality, you were the ones who were for sale. You traded your relationship with your father for an inheritance that you haven't earned. Therefore, your inheritance will be managed entirely by Elena. She is the sole trustee. Every dollar you receive, every bill you want paid, must go through her. You will learn to respect her, not because she is my widow, but because she is now your boss." Eleanor had screamed. Richard had tried to lunge at the table, but the legal documents were airtight. Robert had spent 3 decades ensuring that no one could ever undo his final act of protection. He didn't just give me wealth. He gave me the ultimate power over the people who had spent half my life trying to destroy me. But as I sit here now, looking at the empty chair across from me, I realize that the money and the power aren't the real victory. The real victory is the letter I found tucked into the back of his safe, addressed only to me. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten note, dated 25 years ago, on the night he brought me home from the diner. It said, "Elena, everyone will tell you that I am your savior. They will say I rescued a girl from a monster. But the truth is, I was the one who was drowning. I had all the money in the world, and not a single reason to wake up tomorrow. I didn't save you to be a hero. I saved you because you were the only real thing I had seen in 40 years. Thank you for giving me a home." I finally let the tears fall then. Not for the estate, not for the struggle, but for the man who saw a broken girl and recognized a kindred spirit. They called me a gold digger. They called him a fool. But the 25-year silence is over now, and the truth is finally out. I wasn't his trophy, and he wasn't my bank account. We were 2 people who built a sanctuary out of a tragedy. I stand up, turn off the antique lamp, and walk toward the door. The vultures are still out there, planning their next move, but I am not afraid. I have his name, I have his strength, and I have a lifetime of lessons from the man who taught me that the only thing more powerful than a monster is a love that no one else understands. The silence in the mansion is finally peaceful, because for the first time in 25 years, I don't have to keep any secrets. I am Elena Miller, and I have finally come home.